For it's in his name we do pray. Amen.
Well, good morning. I'm Jeff. I'm normally the preaching minister here, and I'm glad to see you all here this morning. We've been in a series of sermons called The Full Life, and it wasn't my idea exactly. We were talking about this in staff meeting, and Josh Haltom actually had the idea of talking about it, and it's been a pretty good idea. One of the things I didn't expect as a preacher, as I've done this more and more and more, is that it's harder to be short, speak short. It's easier to go long. It's easier because you got all this stuff in your head you're wanting to get out, and it's just easier to go long. My first sermon, that would have really surprised me. My first sermon, I tried to get everything in there I could think of, and I tried to talk slow because I can be really fast if I don't watch out, and I think I preached 6 minutes, which nobody was upset about that. No one's ever hated a 6-minute sermon. Everybody was kind of thrilled about that. But at the time, I thought, man, it's so hard to go long. But after you've done it for a while, it's kind of the opposite. It's hard to be short, because you got all this stuff you want to say. And so a whole series of sermons, like we've been doing, kind of gives me a chance to riff on this from lots of different directions. And I do think that Jesus has promised us a full life. I think that a lot of American Christians don't get there. They don't get that full life. Not if they were describing how their life normally goes. And I guess to be fair, a lot of Americans, period, don't get there. But that's the promise from Jesus, and I do think the church can help you in that journey. And that's kind of what the whole series has been about, and I've been able to hit it on a lot of different, like I said, a lot of different directions. We do kids ministries to help families. We do small groups to help you relate better, and the things we've been talking about. But I wanted to kind of get into something again today to hit that from a different angle, because I still think it's one of the big problems that we go through. I'm 56 years old. In my lifetime, it just seems like we're a lonelier culture than we used to be. It seems like we're a more anxious culture than we used to be. I help every year at Wonder Valley Camp for High School Week, and we'll have to plan every year to help the 20 or 25 or 30 kids who seriously struggle in some way or another with anxiety. This was not a struggle that we dealt with when I was a kid in the 80s. It was not a struggle that we dealt with when I was a youth minister in the 90s and early 2000s. But it is a struggle now. And if you were a student today, you might be thinking, well, that's just how it's always been. But that's not how it's always been. There's a difference. And if you've lived long enough, you can see it. I wish that I could help people to go a different direction. I read this thing, actually it's not hard. Every week when I get ready for this sermon series, I go online to look up evidence online, surveys and different things that kind of back up what I see, that as a culture we've kind of become more lonely, more isolated, more anxious, more worried than we used to be. It's never hard to find something. Last year, at the end of the year, the U.S. Surgeon General put out a memo, a document, where he said Americans are lonelier today than in recent past. And he quoted a statistic in there. And when I first heard it, I wasn't sure if it was true or not. I tried to think about in my own life if this is true. But the statistic was this. He said in 2003, so about 20 years ago, the average American spent about 60 minutes a day with friends. Now, you might not spend 60 minutes every day with friends, but when you calculated it out for the whole week and averaged it out, it worked out to be about 7 hours a week that the average American spent with friends. Well, now, in 2024, it's down to about 20 minutes average a day. It's dropped 2/3. And there's lots of reasons why that's happened, but none bigger than the cell phones that we all carry around in our pockets. You can go to a birthday party or a restaurant or a ball game, and you're surrounded by a bunch of people, and in the same row as you, or at the table just across the aisle from you, somebody's on their phone the whole time. You can be in a crowd and be completely by yourself today in ways that just weren't possible a generation ago. And again, if you were a student today, you might think, well, that's how it's always been, but that's not how it's always been. It's different. It's different. And in our culture, because it is like that, we're seeing evidence that kind of isolation is starting to affect people's health. They have tied, if you feel isolated or lonely, if that's a struggle, it does more damage. I wrote it all down. It affects your heart health. It affects your immunity. It affects your sleep patterns. It affects cognitive decline. They have found that isolation and loneliness can do more to affect your health adversely than a lack of exercise and diet. In other words, it's better to go to Jiffy Treat with friends than to eat broccoli alone. And I know there'll be some of you who that's all you're going to take out of the sermon today. So there you go. Better to have Jiffy Treat with friends than broccoli alone. But the point I'm wanting to make is that if you don't watch out, the isolation can be really detrimental. And this is not a church that put this out. This is the U.S. Surgeon General. This is the government. I mean, it's not a religious thing. It's just a thing. And so you would think, or you would hope, as a minister, I would hope that the church would be better about that. But I don't find that to be true. I think the same patterns that affect the rest of the culture can bleed into here too. And if you don't watch out, even in a room like this, you can be all by yourself. All by yourself, even in a crowd. And this can be the only time that you ever really bounce off of anybody. And even here, you just try to move on as quick as you can. But Jesus said there's a full life available for us. A life of joy and of peace and of purpose. A life that builds you into a more loving, a more kind, a more compassionate person, that life is available and that we're supposed to be part of that. And so when I was trying to think about this week's sermon, and it's all part of the same series of thought, there it is. I wanted to get to this thing here. Command number one is that we have to love each other. Eric talked about that in the communion meditation. I've talked about it in the 3 sermons we've done so far. The kind of love that he's talking about here is an expensive love, and it may not be expensive financially. That's not necessarily true, but it will certainly be expensive in terms of your energy and in terms of your patience and in terms of your time. And sometimes as people, that time is pretty precious, and we have a hard time sharing that time with other people. We want to keep that for ourselves, and we want to keep that to our thing. And so Jesus tells us to put that impulse we have to be isolated, put that aside, reach out and love one another. And the Bible uses lots of different terms to describe that. That kind of relationship. It compares it to a family relationship. Some places it can compare it to a one flesh kind of a thing. In other places it talks about we have that kind of a partnership. Be one with me as I'm one with God. But the Bible often uses this metaphor about shepherding to describe it. And so what I wanted to do for the first part of the sermon is just talk about that metaphor and try to explain that best I can, and then at the end of the sermon talk about how at Mount Pleasant we want to use that metaphor and let that kind of inform us so that we can be less isolated, so we can be less lonely and be more healthy. So shepherding. The Israel, certainly when Jesus was there, was very much still agriculture society. Shepherding was a big part of that. All of the big heroes, it seems like, in the Old Testament were shepherds. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of Jacob's sons, and Moses was a shepherd, and David famously was a shepherd, and God in Psalm 23 says he's a shepherd. Probably the most famous psalm we have, the picture in the Bible, is that God says, that's who I am. And so in our culture where you don't see a lot of flocks of sheep, and if you do see flocks of sheep, they're behind an electric fence. You don't see a shepherd. Some of the metaphor can be lost. But when you think about this psalm here that's so famous, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside the still water. He takes me beside the green pastures. He restores my soul. That's the picture you want to have, that God takes you to the best places. He feeds you in a way that the world can't feed you. He feeds your soul. He makes you better inside. And even if you have to go through the valley of the shadow of death, God is there with you, and He's going to carry you through to a table on the other side. And that's the picture we want to have of God. Another book that picks up a less famous passage, Isaiah chapter 40, he says, the sovereign Lord comes with power and a mighty arm, but He tends His flock like a shepherd, gathers His lambs in His arm and carries them close to His heart. And again, this picture of a person binding up the weak and taking care of the ones that are kind of getting off to the side there, that's the picture that we have of Jesus, and that he's going to gather us there and hold us tight and protect us, help us to be the people that we're supposed to be. Moses, who, like I said, was a shepherd, eventually is recruited to lead the people of Israel, and for 40 years they go through the wilderness. But God says to Moses, you're not going to be taking them into the promised land, and that's a whole long story in Scripture too, but you're not going to get to do it. And Moses is concerned, and so he prays at the end of his life. He prays to the Lord, may the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before him, who will lead them and bring them in, so the Lord's people won't be like sheep without a shepherd. And so Moses, it's the first time in the Bible that metaphor is used to apply to people in the same way that God will use it to apply to himself. And Moses is concerned that it's great that God is up there to shepherd them, but people need somebody sometimes. You need somebody to come alongside you there. It's cool that God is there, and we want to focus on that and think about it and be forever thankful for it. But there's something about a real person being there beside you to help you in those moments. And Moses prays for somebody to come along to do that for the people. Otherwise, he says, they're like sheep without a shepherd. And sheep are kind of dumb animals. I mean, they're kind of foolish animals. They're lonely animals. One sheep can get out and sound so desperate that the other sheep will get out, not because they want to get out, but because the first one's out, and they'll all sort of wander off there together. And so this picture of us as people could get scattered unless somebody can come along to help lead and to help guide and to help push. A verse we've been looking at for the whole series. Jesus says, the thief comes to kill and steal and destroy, but he says, I come to give you life and life to the full. Jesus says, I want you to have the very best kind of life. That's John chapter 10, verse 10. But the verse right after that, verse 11, he says, I'm the good shepherd. So all this goes together. That life to the full that we want to have, we find it through Christ. And for these guys, when he's telling it, he says, you find it through me being here and helping you get through this thing. But I think we're called to be shepherds to one another too. And even after he's gone, there's something about coming alongside people and helping them get where they need to go that we're called to do, and that we do much better at if we do. On both sides, if you're familiar with the Apostle Paul or his story in the Bible, when Paul first became a Christian, he felt inspired to preach. Well, kind of like I did. I mean, I don't compare myself to Paul. Did my little 6-minute sermon, felt pretty good about it. But Paul, he felt compelled to preach. And while I did my little 6-minute sermon, at the end of it, everybody came and said, "Oh, that's a great job. Way to go! You did an awesome job there." When Paul preached his first sermon, people wanted to kill him, and it happened 2 or 3 times like that. And Paul kind of gets away from it. Well, I would have too. I don't blame him. I would have done the same thing. And Paul kind of gets away from it and goes back to his hometown, and as far as we know, doesn't preach at all. And this guy named Barnabas comes along. And Barnabas goes and looks for Paul. Nobody else was looking for Paul, but he does. He says, this guy's got potential. This guy has some talent. And Barnabas goes to Paul and is able to get Paul to come out and try again. It's pretty cool. I mean, if there hadn't been for a guy like Barnabas, I don't know that Paul does the things that he does. I mean, half our New Testament was written by Paul, but if this guy Barnabas hadn't come along at just the right time, I don't know that he does it. And it's not that Paul didn't love Jesus, but sometimes you just need somebody to come along and spur you on. And Paul, once he got going, he found a guy named Timothy, and he kind of brought him along. And you need both those things in your life. You need a Barnabas who will come and give you a good word when you need it. And you need a Timothy that you can invest in. And for whatever it's worth, you may have to seek both those things out. I think we always hope that'll happen organically, but it doesn't always. And you may have to seek that out. One of my authors I like is a guy named Donald Miller, He wrote a book called Blue Like Jazz several years ago that's pretty good. And I got to hear him in a conference once, and I was kind of excited about it. I thought we'd get some real depth of whatever. And he comes out, and his first thing, he was talking about flying. He was on an airplane, he said, recently on a long flight, and you could press in different channels to listen to on your headphones, and one of the channels you could press in was to hear the pilots as they're talking while you're flying along. You could hear them talk to other pilots, hear them talk to the towers. You could listen into that conversation. And I think that'd be awful to listen to, but he was real excited about it because he said, I've always kind of thought flying was cool, and I thought they'd be talking about vectors and approach landings and different things, and I might learn something. Just listen to him. He said most of it was just talking about the weather. He said you'd have one guy says he's way out in front of where we're at, and oh yeah, it's pretty rough up here. You may want to go a little higher. Oh no, this is great flying over here. This is where you want to be. And they're talking back and forth that way. You know, guys who had went a little further, warning the guys behind them what was coming. And then the guys in Donald Miller's plane warning the guys behind them what they're going to get into. And that's kind of an interesting picture of shepherding. I mean, you've been through some things, and so you try to help somebody else coming along. So maybe they won't have to go through the same turbulence that you went through. And maybe you can seek out somebody who's a little further along in this walk with Christ than you are. And when you sit down with them, maybe they'll give you some tips so you don't have to skin your knees on the things they had to skin their knees on. And this picture of shepherding, looking out for one another, like a shepherd does with sheep, it's rooted in Jesus, and we're all called to do it. And I think it addresses, it's one of the things, it addresses this lack of a full life that so many of us get into. Peter, at the end of his letter, Peter wrote 1st and 2nd Peter, and at the end of his letter, he says this here. He said, a word to you elders in the church. And now he's talking about that word elder. That's a specific group of people. That most churches have a group of people who kind of are in charge of the church at large. I mean, they're the shepherds. They're the ones who kind of help us try to stay straight. And our church has some guys like that, and they try to help us figure out what the next things are. And Peter writes to them. But again, for our purposes here, I want you to think bigger than just that group. He's writing to that group, and it applies to them, and it would apply to that group here at our church too, the group of elders who kind of lead the church. But I think this notion of shepherding is bigger. So think of it bigger. If you've got some people that you influence, if you've got some people that you kind of help, think of where you could fit into this thing, even if you aren't titled an elder. He says to the elders in the churches, he says, I'm an elder, Peter says. I'm a witness to what Jesus went through, and I'm going to share in his glory one day when he's revealed to the whole world. And as a fellow elder, he says, I appeal to you, you need to care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. You need to take care of them. And then he goes through this whole list of hows. He says, I want you to do it, watch over them willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you're going to get out of it, but because you're eager to serve God. And don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. There's just so much stuff in here that when I talk about shepherding, this slide is the stuff that I have in my head. I mean, you want to do it willingly. You're not forced to do it. I mean, we were talking last night, some friends of ours, and Julia and I were having a conversation. We were talking about a teacher that we both knew and how they had done in their long teaching career. And they decided to retire early, for a teacher. I mean, they retired as soon as they could. Like 55, they were out. Because they didn't want to be one of those teachers who stayed on even after they started hating the kids. Have you ever had a teacher like that who stayed on even after they started hating the kids? That's an experience, isn't it? If you've ever had that, that's a lot of fun. And you think to yourself, really, you could do anything. But you picture this person when they got into teaching, as a young person, all bright-eyed and excited, ready to go. Now, a lot less bright-eyed, a lot less excited, and now they're just getting, I can't do anything else and get this same check. So I'm going to put my time in, but the joy is gone. We've all, at different times, went through something like that, sat under a teacher like that. It's very easy to do, and what Peter's saying is, man, don't be that kind of person. Don't be that kind of person. If if the joy is, now, you could hear me wrong on this, on this church kind of thing, on this leading in the church and trying to help somebody in the church. If the joy is gone, the answer might not be for you to quit. The answer might be for you to try to find that joy again. I have found in the church, and I can't speak for teachers in the school, I think it's a little different animal, but in the church, when somebody no longer has the joy to love like they should, they no longer have the joy to serve like they should, it's usually not just a problem there, but a problem with how they're relating to God. They don't really enjoy any of it anymore. They don't read their Bibles, they don't pray, they don't think about the Lord, they don't worship. They've just gotten very distant from God. And as they've gotten very distant from God, it's become very easy to be distant from people. So the secret here, if that's you, that there's no longer, it's just grudgingly, you don't have any heart for it anymore, is, focus on God again. Get your heart back on God again. I sought the Lord, and He heard, and He answered, and my life is different because of that. You know, because I was able to grab a hold of God, God was able to take me to a place where I could think clear again. This world makes sense because of what God has done, and you try to rediscover your passion. It says, don't lord it over. Don't lord it over the people. I don't know why this is, but churches can produce people like that. I have heard all my life, people come to the churches that I'm at, and they'll say, oh yeah, the church I left, it was a minister there who thought it was all about him, or some family at the church just ran everything, and we finally had enough. And I don't know why that happens. In fact, the church should be the last place that sort of thing would happen, but it's not true. I had a little friction with some of my elders in California. We both had different ideas about what we were trying to get done, and one of the guys I was having friction with came to me and said, I'm a little concerned that you're starting to boss people around. And I didn't think I was doing that, but I thought, okay, well, let's have the conversation and figure it out, if that's what's going on. And he said, you need to realize, we elders, says, we're the jefe of the church. Jefe is Spanish for boss. So we're the jefe of the church. And that led to a whole other conversation. Then I wanted to talk. The church doesn't need bosses. The church has never needed bosses. We have a boss. He's Jesus Christ. We don't need a second boss or even an underboss to come in after that one. Don't need bosses. And in fact, the more you try to lord it over other people, the more they resent it, and they start to back away. I read this thing, Alcoholics Anonymous. They discovered when they first started, that they couldn't pressure the alcoholics in any form. They had to be led and not pushed. In other respects, we had to make haste slowly. When first contacted, most of the alcoholics just wanted to get sober. They clung to all their other defects, only letting go little by little. And then this line here, most people didn't want to get too good too soon. I find that to be true still. And if you're a youth sponsor and you start pounding away at the youth about how they're not good enough, they'll just quit coming. If you're a preacher and you start pounding away every week about how people are letting you down, they'll find someone else to listen to. And if you think you can boss people around and make them do what you want to do, I have found that to be ineffective. One of the funniest things I get accused of sometimes is that I'm trying to run the whole church. It's like herding cats. And I don't know that it can be done, to be honest, that one person can run it all, unless you really guilt and horrify everybody. And you're so far from Christ at that point that you're nowhere. You're not going to produce the full life in anybody, least of all yourself. So he says, don't lord it over other people. Just lead them by your own good example. Help people to know that there's a better way to go. Just keep nudging them forward. He says one day, Peter does, when the great shepherd appears, you'll get a crown of never-ending glory and honor. This will pay off, he says. So that's the first two-thirds of the sermon. The last little thing I want to say about that, this whole deal, how do we then at Mount Pleasant apply that lesson? We do it a couple different ways. First of all, we do select elders and deacons to kind of lead the church. They don't really represent the church. You know, you think about the House of Representatives, we elect a congressman to go represent us in Congress. That's not really how elders are supposed to think. They're representing Christ. They're representing Christ to us. That has to be kind of the goal. And you lead real gentle. You can't give commands. Commands don't really work. You have to lead like Jesus did. And so we select some people. They would tell you, if I got all the elders on stage right now, that they feel totally unqualified for the position. And actually, that they believe that is what probably qualifies them for the position. It is daunting. I mean, it is daunting to be in that kind of a thing. We ask them, we push them, in fact, the elders, to delegate more and more to the deacons who also help out, so the deacons can take care of the business of the church and the elders can focus on Christ-likeness. How as a church are we becoming more like Him? Disciple making. How as a church are we making more disciples and becoming more like Him in how we do? It's a flawed system. I don't want to pretend like it always works 100% the right way, because it doesn't, but that's the goal. And we try to keep that goal in front of us all the time. But it's not just those guys. We've also established these small groups and these different classes and ministries, and we ask the leaders of those groups to shepherd their people. We ask them to keep track of people, to ask questions. How are you doing? And try to really care. If you see a family is having trouble, try to step in there and make some sort of a difference. And if it's more than you can do, make sure you help get other people in there to help out. We want to look after one another. And it's not about being judgmental, because I don't think judgmental works. It's not about power. I don't think power works. It's just about loving people. I think everybody needs somebody above them who's been in this thing a little longer to tell us where the turbulence is. And I think everybody needs somebody coming after them a little further back who they can help get there too. I think one of the reasons why in the church this loneliness and this isolation we feel is such a disappointment is that we of all people are supposed to remember who we are. We're not supposed to be independent contractors. That's not how Christianity works. Now, if I were to look around and make eye contact with some of you, I could make eye contact with a few people who think that is, in fact, how Christianity should work. That you can come here and show up and not really get too deeply connected, and that's enough. And I just want you to know it won't get you there. It just won't get you there. Part of following Christ. You know, LeBron James has a coach. Whatever you think of LeBron James, I don't know, but he has a coach. They just hired a new coach to come in, and LeBron had a lot to do with picking that guy. LeBron's been playing ball almost as long as I've been around, and you would think LeBron at this point, does he need a coach? I mean, how much more could somebody and whoever LeBron gets to be the coach is going to know less about basketball than LeBron does. So why would he want to coach at this point? Well, I think he knows, like every athlete seems to know, there's just some value in getting another set of eyes on this thing. Sin blinds us. We just don't see our faults. We just don't see where we're having trouble. We think we do, but if you're in a circle of people and one of those people is obnoxious, there's 10 people, one's obnoxious, who's the only guy who doesn't know? Well, the obnoxious one. That's always how that works. And having been the obnoxious one more than one time, I can tell you it's not fun to find out later that it is you. But unless someone can kind of help you see that thing, you're never going to grow. You're never going to become the best version of you. We need another set of eyes on us. But no matter who you are, you've already learned some things about the Christian life. You may not be as smart as the guy beside you. Look at the guy beside you and evaluate whether or not you're smarter than the guy beside you. You may not be smarter than that guy, but you're smarter than somebody in here, I promise. And so find ways to show them what you've learned. Share what you've done, what you've figured out. It breaks my heart that somebody could be completely isolated in this community. But I know you can. I know it's possible. I just want to make it less and less possible all the time. And that's why we do the things we do. And that's why we set it up the way we set it up. And that's what we're inviting you guys into. To jump into these groups, to jump into the church deeper, to become known. So I'm going to pray for you here in a second. And I want to pray on both sides of this. I want you to think about the people who maybe you could help. It may be, as we're talking about this, a certain face will pop into your head. Somebody that you could say, it's just a little bit of encouragement. I think about Tommy Oakes did that for me, and I know not everybody knows who that is, but he's a minister in Tennessee, and when I didn't think I could do this at all, he called me aside and encouraged me at just the right time. If he hadn't come along and done that, I don't know what I would have done. I think about guys like Mark Bourne and Bruce Cameron, who at different times pulled me aside. And I know those names don't mean anything to you, for a lot of you, but they pulled me aside. Lee Johnson pulled me aside and said, I see something here. Hadn't been for guys like that, I don't know who I'd have been. And you could be that for somebody. And you see the potential, you need to call it out. But for a lot of us too, we need to make sure there's somebody above us who's helping us. And that's again where these groups can become important, where your elders can become important, where different leaders in the church can become important. And I encourage you to reach out there too. We all want to grow up in Christ. So whatever face God's put in your head, I want to pray about this thing and pray that you get a little better connected here. So pray with me. Dear Lord God, I thank you for this time and for this church and for this group. And I ask you, God, for anybody in here who's more isolated than they should be, help us to get better connected. I pray, God, for the different leaders in the church, the guys who have allowed themselves to be elders or deacons or group leaders. I know what a load that is. And again, God, I pray that you pour a fire on their heart, help them to see how they can bless the people that they're working with. And I pray for the people in here, God, who desperately need someone older and wiser who's been through a few things to come in and speak life. I just pray, God, again, you make all those things happen in ways that I can't. God, help us to be an encouragement to one another and lift one another up. Nobody stands alone here, God. Help that to be true. In Christ's name.